Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and pull out the most interesting and useful insights.
And for this deep dive, we're looking at a stack of material covering something many of us navigate: managing difficult emotions and experiences. Specifically, we're focusing on the impact of romantic breakups and also strategies for navigating anxiety.
Yeah, it's a big topic. Our sources for this are pretty varied. We've got findings from a scientific systematic review, some practical advice from a health information site, insights from a Reddit community thread, which should be interesting, and guidance from a university's guide on managing anxiety.
Right, so our mission today is really to connect the dots between these, challenging life events and our emotional well-being, and maybe most importantly, to pull out the practical wisdom and actionable strategies from these sources that you can actually use to cope and build resilience.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this stack and dive in.
Yeah.
So let's kick things off by looking closely at the impact of, well, romantic breakups. We're drawing on research that really treats this common experience seriously.
That's right. This systematic review we looked at focused on breakups and their potential role in increasing vulnerability to emotional disorders. It's fascinating to see such a common, deeply personal pain being rigorously studied like this.
And it wasn't small, was it? The review pulled from 18 studies, different countries, over 20,000 participants. That's a lot of data.
It really is. It confirms that breakups aren't just, sad. They have measurable impacts on emotional health.
So what did the findings highlight?
Well, consistently, romantic breakup is identified as a significant stressor event. A key insight was its aggravating role in increasing depression severity, especially for people who already have a history of depression.
Okay. So it's like a pre-existing vulnerability makes the breakup hit even harder.
Exactly. It can exacerbate existing struggles. But it also pointed out that breakups can lead to sort of a loss of capacity for behavioral change and reduced social support. And that combination can make someone more vulnerable to developing other emotional disorders too, not just depression.
Right, like a kind of cascading effect.
Precisely. And another study really dug into how a breakup affects self-concept.
Your idea of yourself.
Yeah, the insight here is that because partners often kind of merge identities over time, developing this shared self-concept, losing that partner can actually reduce the clarity of your individual self-concept. And that reduced self-clarity. The research identifies it as a predictor of emotional distress after the relationship ends.
Wow, that makes so much sense. It's like you lose a mirror you used to understand yourself. Your sense of who I am gets blurry when the we disappears.
Spot on. And the sources even included details from interviews in Iran that described this intense pain using a really powerful term, love trauma syndrome.
Love trauma syndrome. Okay, tell me more about that.
Yes. And they categorized the reactions into two types: cognitive maladaptive reactions and maladaptive emotional reactions.
Okay, cognitive first.
On the cognitive side, what really stands out are the mental loops and distortions people get stuck in. Things like disorientation, struggling with decision-making, bargaining, trying to mentally undo what happened, change beliefs, cognitive distortions, and maybe the most relatable one, rumination.
Oh, rumination, just replaying things over and over, dissecting every moment. That definitely feels like a cognitive trap after a breakup.
It does. And the emotional side? That list from the source is incredibly heavy.
Yeah.
It includes intense feelings like failure, worthlessness, confusion, fear, inadequacy, grief, vulnerability, deep depression, anger, jealousy. Even things like boredom, unwillingness, frustration, and hatred.
Wow.
What's notable is just the sheer range and intensity described. It goes way beyond simple sadness. Recognizing this whole pattern, this love trauma syndrome, is kind of an insight in itself. It's a complex, multifaceted response.
It really helps to put a name to that overwhelming feeling. How do these specific findings about breakups, connect to broader psychological models of anxiety or emotional distress?
Well, the review links these experiences to models like the triple vulnerability model. The core idea there is that disturbing thoughts and feelings become truly problematic when you pair them with negative metacognitive beliefs.
Beliefs about your thoughts.
Exactly. Like believing that just having a negative thought means it's automatically true or dangerous. This creates a kind of vicious cycle, reinforcing the negative emotions and potentially leading to unhelpful behaviors to cope.
Which just makes things worse.
Right. So it's not just the thought itself, but what you believe that thought means. The sources also reference the anxiety tolerance model. This suggests that for some, perceiving the breakup as absolute turmoil can lead to chronic anxiety, basically stemming from a real difficulty tolerating the uncertainty of life without that partner or relationship structure. And that brings us pretty naturally to our sources that dive deep into understanding and managing anxiety itself, which is relevant whether that anxiety is triggered by a breakup or exams or, well, anything else.
Right. And the University Guide gives a really clear picture of how anxiety shows up physically. It describes that familiar fight or flight response, doesn't it?
It does. Increased heart rate, faster breathing to get oxygen pumping, tense muscles ready for action, sweating to cool down, dilated pupils, taking everything in.
A racing mind focused on threats, maybe shaking, goosebumps.
All of it.
You can't do
It's
that.
our evolutionary alarm system. But the crucial insight here is that while it's useful in a real crisis, getting stuck in that high gear without an actual physical threat, that's what leads to distress and burnout.
And anxiety doesn't just hit the body, it twists our thinking. The sources call these anxious thought distortions, right? Can you give an example?
Yeah, a classic one mentioned is generalizing. The distortion is believing something will happen the same way it did before, only because it happened that way before. Completely ignoring any changed circumstances or new skills you might have developed.
Oh, like, I messed up that presentation last year, so I know I'll mess this one up too, even if you've practiced way more this time.
Exactly that. It's that trap of letting the past dictate the future, ignoring any evidence of change. The sources also help clarify terms like panic attack.
Yeah, what's the specific definition they use?
According to the DSM-5, it's defined as an abrupt surge of intense fear or discomfort that peaks really quickly, usually within minutes.
And it's important to understand, the sources stress this, that just having a panic attack isn't the same as having panic disorder.
Absolutely critical distinction. Panic disorder involves having frequent, unexpected attacks and then persistently worrying about having more or significantly changing your behavior to avoid them. That needs a clinical diagnosis from a healthcare professional.
Okay, so we understand the symptoms, the distorted thinking. Now for the toolbox. The sources offer a whole lot of coping strategies. Let's start with ones involving the mind and body connection.
Sure. Muscle relaxation techniques are recommended. Progressive muscle relaxation, where you deliberately tense and then release different muscle groups, is one they mention.
How does that help?
Well, the insight is that by consciously controlling that physical tension, you can actually help interrupt the body's anxiety response. It promotes relaxation during an overwhelming moment.
Actively working with the body's signals. Makes sense. Mindfulness exercises are also suggested, aiming to sort of ground you in the present.
Right. A really practical technique described involves using your 5 senses, like noticing 5 things you see, 5 things you hear, maybe 4 things you can feel, 3 things you smell, 2 you taste, and maybe 1 thing you're grateful for.
Okay.
The insight there is that this simple sensory scan pulls your attention out of those anxious thoughts looping in your head and anchors it firmly in your immediate reality. It takes practice, though, especially when you're already feeling overwhelmed.
Definitely sounds like it takes practice. And visualizing a happy place, that sounds a bit like a mental escape hatch.
It kind of is, yeah. And it's backed by the sources as a genuinely helpful strategy. Visualizing somewhere quiet, calm, relaxing. It can reduce stress and anxiety. Some research even suggests that visualizing nature scenes can be particularly effective. It's using your imagination constructively.
Nice. And for something more active, there's exercise.
Absolutely. Light exercise is mentioned for managing symptoms right in the moment.
Okay.
But the broader insight from multiple sources, including that Reddit thread, is that regular exercise might actually reduce your chances of developing anxiety in the first place. It pumps feel-good chemicals, as the Reddit source put it.
So it's both a quick fix and a long-term preventative strategy.
Seems that way.
Okay, so move your body, pay attention to your senses, visualize calm, relax your muscles. That covers the mind-body side. What about strategies focused more directly on the mind, on our thoughts?
Well, seeking counseling, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is strongly recommended across the sources.
Right, CBT.
The core idea of CBT is that by changing your thought patterns and your behaviors, you can actually change how you feel about challenging situations.
And the sources mentioned some evidence. Something about brain structures.
Yeah, some evidence suggesting CBT might even impact brain structures involved in panic symptoms. And a meta-analysis found it moderately effective for anxiety disorders overall.
Okay.
But it's important to remember, other types of therapy can also be incredibly helpful. CBT isn't the only path. A key cognitive strategy mentioned in the sources and often part of CBT is directly challenging those anxious thought distortions we talked about earlier.
So identifying the distorted thought, like the generalizing one, and then really evaluating how realistic it actually is.
Exactly. You might even write down more balanced coping statements, put them on a card or in your phone so you have them ready when anxiety or overwhelm hits hard.
Like having a script prepared for your rational mind to use when your anxious mind takes over.
Precisely. Then there's the worry time technique, which sounds...
It's a bit counterintuitive. Schedule time to worry.
It does, yeah, but it can be a really powerful strategy for gaining control. The insight is that by scheduling a specific block of time, say 20 minutes each day, just for worrying, you train your brain to contain those worries.
So if a worry pops up outside that time?
You jot it down quickly and tell yourself, okay, I'll deal with that during my worry time later. The goal isn't to stop worrying entirely, but to significantly limit the amount of your day that worries consume, giving you back mental space.
Okay, so you're not suppressing the worry, just relocating it to a designated slot.
Interesting.
And journaling.
Journaling, writing letters, even if you never send them, or even making voice recordings are highlighted. There are ways to process feelings, gain perspective. The Reddit source mentioned writing letters to an ex and then sort of ritualistically destroying them as a form of release and closure. The core insight is that getting that internal turmoil out of your head onto paper into a recording can provide clarity. It helps you feel like you're moving forward. Plus, looking back at old entries later can really show you how much progress you've made.
Yeah, that's true. And just listing things you're grateful for, the gratitude journal.
Yeah, the gratitude journal. It's simple, but the act of regularly listing things you're grateful for, even small things, is suggested as a way to intentionally shift your focus, aiming to increase overall happiness and counteract those negative thought patterns.
Okay, moving on to behavioral strategies, things we can actually do. The University Guide introduces something called behavioral experiments. Sounds intense.
It can be, but it's a really impactful technique according to the sources. The core idea is using planned action to directly test out and challenge your anxious thoughts.
How does that work, practically?
Okay, so you identify an anxious thought like, if I speak up in this meeting, everyone will think I'm incompetent. Then you design a small, safe experiment to test it, maybe speaking up briefly in a low-stakes setting first.
Right.
You anticipate what you might usually do to feel safe. Those are called safety behaviors, like maybe mumbling or avoiding eye contact. And then you try to carry out the experiment without relying on those safety behaviors, impossible. Finally, you honestly evaluate what actually happened versus what you feared would happen.
Like that example from the sources.
Yeah.
Someone terrified of looking stupid, purposefully answering a question wrong in a supportive study group, just to see the actual reaction.
Exactly. The insight is that often the feared catastrophe, well, it doesn't happen. Or at least, it's nowhere near as bad as your anxious mind predicted. This mismatch weakens the anxious thought and gives weight to a more realistic alternative. It's learning through doing, directly confronting the fear.
That makes sense. The Reddit source also had some specific behavioral advice related to breakups, which felt pretty action-oriented too.
Yes, a key piece of advice there was basically not to change your entire life, just to avoid places or activities you associated with your ex.
Don't let the breakup shrink your world.
Right. The suggestion is that eventually you should actually try to return to those places. The insight is that by creating new positive memories there, maybe with friends or on your own, you can start to override or at least dilute the painful old ones. That source had a great line, something like, "It was where you and your ex used to have tea, but now it's where you and your friends spill the tea."
Huh. I love that reframing. It's about taking the space back, reclaiming it.
It really is. And setting ambitious new goals is proposed as another behavioral strategy.
Okay.
The insight here is that directing your energy and focus towards chasing new hopes and dreams is a powerful way to counteract the stagnation and despair that can follow a breakup. It gives you something positive to actively do.
And for many, eventually, starting to date again when you feel genuinely ready is a behavioral step.
The sources mention this, yeah. Not just as a potential source of new romance, but also simply as a way to practice having fun and navigating life while being single, and maybe being mindful of patterns from the past you want to avoid repeating.
What about those really tricky situations where you have to maintain contact with an ex, like for co-parenting, or maybe you're temporarily still sharing a living space?
Yeah, the advice there is very direct and practical. Strive to be polite, professional. Keep interactions and conversations minimal, focused only on what is absolutely necessary.
Treat it like a necessary transaction almost.
Pretty much. The insight is to minimize that emotional exposure as much as possible in those unavoidable situations. Stepping back a bit from the specific techniques, the university guide also touches on some broader concepts that feed into anxiety, like intolerance of uncertainty.
Right, having a really hard time coping when you don't know the outcome.
Exactly. The guide frames this as a key factor in generalized anxiety, and it offers the insight that you need to learn to cope with uncertainty, not eliminate it entirely because you can't, right? They compare it to managing a dietary allergy.
So how do you learn to cope?
Practical steps involve first identifying the behaviors you use to try and reduce uncertainty, things like excessive checking, over-planning, constantly seeking reassurance. And then gradually practicing not doing those things, starting small, and replacing those behaviors with the healthy coping strategies we've already talked about.
So if you always double-check that the door's locked 5 times, you practice checking it just once, maybe twice, and then walking away, even if it feels uncomfortable at first.
Exactly that. It's about building your tolerance muscle for uncertainty. And then there's a particularly profound idea that came from the Reddit source referencing Viktor Frankl.
The idea that the antidote to suffering is finding meaning in it.
Yes. The insight here is powerful. Finding a specific purpose, something maybe only you can fulfill, can make the agony of suffering more bearable. It can provide the will to live and endure difficult times.
Wow.
The source even suggests framing our present struggles as something future generations might derive meaning from, respecting the sacrifices and pain endured by those who came before us. It's a really radical reframing of pain, moving it from something pointless to something potentially purposeful.
That really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? From just surviving the pain to potentially transforming it.
It does. And importantly, these sources also touch on getting professional help. They note that conditions like panic disorder require diagnosis by a healthcare professional.
And there was a note about medication, too.
Yes, a significant one, highlighting the need to be fully aware of potential risks with certain medications, specifically benzodiazepines like Xanax. They carry serious FDA-boxed warnings about physical dependence, withdrawal, misuse, addiction, overdose, even death.
So the message is?
These should only ever be taken strictly as prescribed by a doctor. It really underscores the seriousness of their use and the importance of professional guidance.
The university guide also gave us some context for managing anxiety in specific situations, like exam anxiety or just feeling generally overwhelmed.
Right, because these situations often blend academic pressure with personal life stuff, don't they? Strategies include looking at your academic habits. Are your study methods working? How's your time management? Is your course load too much? Are extracurriculars adding too much pressure?
And recognizing personal stressors, too.
Exactly. Things like relationship conflict or family issues are often intertwined and definitely contribute to feeling overwhelmed.
Time management seemed to come up again as a key tool there for preventing that academic overwhelm.
Absolutely. The guidance really emphasizes creating and sticking to schedules, setting priorities, asking clarifying questions about tasks to maximize your approach, like thinking about short-term versus long-term impact,
Right.
and ensuring accountability, whether that's just to yourself or maybe to a friend, or using techniques like a not-to-do list or that simple 5-minute rule.
The 5-minute rule, just commit to starting something overwhelming for 5 minutes, because often just starting is the hardest part.
Precisely. It breaks the inertia. And for managing those personal life stressors when academic demands are super high, they suggest a technique called backburnering.
Backburnering. So consciously setting the personal issue aside for a bit.
Yes. It's about deliberately deferring dealing with it until a less demanding time, and practicing putting worries about it out of your mind temporarily just so you can focus on the urgent academic task at hand. The key insight is that it's a conscious, temporary strategy during peak stress, not a long-term avoidance pattern.
Which circles back to what the guide highlights about unhealthy coping strategies, right?
Exactly. Things like using substances or just outright avoidance. They might offer immediate, short-term relief, but the core insight is clear. They make anxiety worse in the long run. They actually prevent you from learning and practicing healthy ways to cope effectively. They become barriers to building real resilience. We've definitely covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's been quite a journey through these sources.
Yeah, we really have. We started by understanding the documented impact of romantic breakups, seeing how research shows it's a major stressor linked to emotional vulnerability. We even explored those specific cognitive and emotional reactions tied to what some sources called love trauma syndrome.
Then we unpacked the nuts and bolts of anxiety itself, how it can hijack our bodies and distort our thoughts.
And we pulled together a pretty robust toolbox of practical strategies from all these different sources, health experts, researchers, even lived experience from the Reddit community. Strategies for managing anxiety and emotional distress, whether it's from heartbreak or other life challenges.
We looked at techniques for calming the body, like relaxation and mindfulness, strategies for reframing the mind, like challenging thoughts and using worry time, and ways to take action through things like behavioral experiments, journaling, and actively rebuilding your life.
We touched on those broader concepts too, learning to tolerate uncertainty, and that really profound idea of finding meaning in suffering. Plus, the crucial role of professional help when needed, and being informed about medication risks.
Yeah. What seems clear from this stack of sources is that while the pain of difficult experiences can feel incredibly overwhelming, there are documented pathways and practical tools available for coping, for healing, and for building resilience on the other side.
Definitely. So here's something maybe to consider as you process all this. If that idea that finding meaning in your suffering is the antidote resonates with you, as one source suggested, what meaning could you perhaps begin to assign to a difficult experience you might be navigating right now?